Hello everyone, in today's video we're going to be taking a look at scope. Now scope is an interesting problem that often comes up with various functions that you're using inside Python. And it's one of those things for those of you who are coming from C++ or C or even Java, you've kind of gotten used to dealing with scope issues. But Python, because of its net structure, makes it a little different. And we'll take a look at that, for example. So let's go ahead and create a really simple function that basically takes a value and adds two values together. So I'm going to go, I'll call this one sum. I'll say val1, and I'll call it val2. And we're going to go ahead and make it super easy. Return val1 plus val2. Yes, that's pretty simple, not too bad. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to come down here, and I'm now going to go ahead and define a variable. I'm going to call it n equals, actually we'll call it n1 equals 5, n2 equals 10. And what we're going to do is we're going to use my sum function for the purposes of adding those two together, and then we'll go ahead and make a value. So I'll say total equals sum of n1 and n2. And then if we print total, what I expect to see is I expect to see the sum of these two values. Again, this is basically a review of everything we did last time. So that checks. We end up with 15 there. So everything worked fine. That worked great. Now, here's where things start to get a little interesting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back here, and I'm going to go ahead and take that n1, and I'm going to replace it with val1, and I'm going to come here and replace this with val2. Of course, that means I have to come down here and set this to val1, and I have to come down here and make that val2. Otherwise, it's going to give me all sorts of nastiness. Whoop, val22, that sounds good to me. Now, your brain is going to start sparkling a little bit because you're going to look here and see val1, you're going to see val1, you're going to see val1, you're going to see val1, and you're going to be like, uh-oh, what's going to happen when you run this code? Nothing. It'll work perfectly fine. And the reason it's going to work perfectly fine is because these two values here are values that are outside of the scope of this function. This val1 and val2 belongs to this function. This val1 and val2 belongs to the entire program. As a matter of fact, if I wanted to, I could actually take those two values and I could throw them up top like that. Now you're sitting here going, oh, scandalous, but if I run it, watch what happens. No problem at all. Even though I named them the same as the stuff I'm using inside of my function, it didn't cause an issue because of the fact that I didn't do anything. Again, this is separate. Remember, a variable is really just a pointer in memory saying, hey, look in here if you want the value. The pointer, again, it's anywhere in memory. This is just Python's way of keeping those separate. Now, there's sometimes a place when you want to keep track of something. So let's go ahead and build ourselves a little bit of a function that rolls some dice here, just for the purposes of kind of showing you where this can get a little complicated. So I'm going to go ahead and grab myself the random library. I'm going to go ahead and define myself a roll. And inside that roll, it's going to be Byte-Sized, like that. And I'll keep it nice and simple. And I'm just going to return, keep it nice and simple. Random.randint between 1 and dice sides. Whoops, I've got to do that. And what this is going to do is this is going to go ahead and roll a dice for us, and it's going to give us the ability to do it. Now, the reason it's screaming at me there is theoretically my import has to be at the top. It's getting grumpy here because they don't have enough spaces, and again, it's warning me that sum is something that can be built in from time to time, just something that you have to kind of be mindful of. So what I've done here is I've written a function called roll, and it's basically going to roll a dice that's going to be between 1 and the number of sides that I have on that dice. That makes sense. But let's say I want to keep track of how many dice I've rolled so far. That gets complicated. So let's say a dice rolled plus equals 1. Now, this is impossible. There is no dice rolled value. It does not exist. So you're saying, oh, I've got a solution to this. I'm just going to take dice rolled and I'm going to go toss it over here and put it to 0 when my program starts. That still does not work because this dice rolled value is outside of the scope of this function. So now this cannot work. I mean, the function itself will work fine. D equals roll 6. That would roll a 6-sided dice. And now the reason that doesn't work for us, of course, is as I've mentioned, it simply does not connect. This value cannot be read out of the main program. Now, one of the nice things that they give you in Python is the ability to grab this particular value and point it. To do that, I'm simply going to come up here and type in global and then type in the name of the value that I want. So as you can see here, I now have a variable called dice rolled, and I'm actually grabbing it out of the global context, loading it into my function context so I can keep track of it. Now, the cool thing here is if I come down here with my dice rolled, I can use it to keep track of how many dice that I roll. So I can actually say F, the roll was a, what do we say, D, and you've rolled dice rolled times. Keep it nice and simple. So now if I copy paste this, I'll go ahead and do it. I know, we shouldn't do that. So now, of course, if I come in here and run this, which we'll see here is the roll was a 1 and you rolled 1 times because we added 1 to that global variable when we went around. We rolled a second time and we went ahead and did it 2 times. The value became a 5. We did it 3 times and you can see here that it actually keeps track of that value. Now, one of the things you're probably saying here is, can you have these global values actually be shared between functions? And the answer is yes, you can. You just have to be very careful because you have a lot of fingers basically twisting around like spaghetti, trying to reach into each other to make sure that one of them basically owns that value at any time. That can get very, 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 very messy. For example, if we wanted to come in here, roll d8, that's kind of a fun one. We don't need to pass anything to it. We can basically say dice rolled, actually global, dice rolled. Then we're going to go say dice rolled plus equals 1. And then, of course, we're going to say return, what do we say, random.randint. Again, I'm keeping this relatively straightforward, hopefully. And that works pretty well because then we're going to get an 8-sided dice. And each time we roll that particular one, it's actually going to go ahead and add 1 to that dice rolled because we got that global copy of that, even though these two functions are kept separately from each other. Now, one of the things that a lot of people will do is they'll actually have a helper function for the purposes of incrementing things rather than trying to grab yourself a copy of that variable every single time you need it. That's one of the really, really safe ways to program, but that's getting more into the scope of what I would consider application development, game development. We're getting a little outside of this is how Python works. I also call that style more than I would call actual functionality. But as you can see, scope is a very, very interesting problem that we have inside of Python. Functions can talk to functions if they're in the same scope. Variables, you need to go ahead and grab a copy of. If you were curious, by the way, you can grab more than one global copy of something. For example, if I had a variable called n, I could just do a comma and do an n, and basically go global all the way across the screen for all the global values that I want. Now, where things get really messy, and this is a preview of where we're going eventually, is this is also going to be a scenario in which you're basically going to grab a variable from a different program. Now, that is when things get very, very messy, but that is for another day. Enjoy.